It was definitely not an Uda, although it walked on 2 legs. Emotions that he could not identify or understand made it difficult to study the animal for its dangers. The Jai-He fur was completely grey. TT knew that the beasts turned grey with age, but he had never seen one. The one grey pelt he had seen was only grey around the neck. Hunters said old Jai-He were more dangerous because their teeth and claws were longer and they just grew meaner with age. If that creature had taken the gift of a whole pelt, it was obviously more dangerous than a grey Jai-He. Its mane was upside down. Instead of its mouth and jaw being free of fur, the lower half of its face and neck were nearly lost in long, shaggy white hair. The space above its eyes to halfway across its head was bare skin. It was carrying something in one hand, but the shape did not suggest a weapon. After sitting on a large, flat rock next to the fire, the creature stared at the thing for a long time. Occasionally, it made something within it move, then stared at it again. When TT realized that night was near, he wondered what to do. He could not imagine how that creature would react to another fire. A solution presented itself when the creature finally turned its attention from the thing on its lap, then made some sounds while looking at the sky. Walking slowly, as if drained from a great test, it went inside its peculiar foot. TT concluded that the creature must have made the shelter, but it was beyond imagining how a creature not much larger than he was could do such a thing. More astonishment filled him when the light of a fire came from within the foot. As the night grew dark, TT moved cautiously along the clearing's edge to a position that let him see inside the neatly stacked trees. Things he did not recognize filled its interior. The strange creature was doing something to a large black stone hanging above the fire, which was inside a tall pile of neatly stacked rocks, obviously meant to keep it from eating the food. When the aroma of food reached his nose, TT speculated that the black stone was some kind of tool for heating food without letting the fire eat it, which seemed a complicated idea for something as simple as cooking food. He could identify the meat as a looker bird, but the other scents that mixed with it were unknown. TT remained crouched at the edge of the clearing as night grew full, eyeing the fading fire outside and studying the creature inside. His plan had been to wait until it went to sleep, then quietly feed its fire through the night. But well after the moon was above the forest, the creature was still awake. It ate a meal and continued staring at the thing it had been looking at since afternoon. TT concluded that the creature had been pondering the thing, and it must have been very important to keep its attention for so long. Being so far from the fire, TT felt uneasy. He followed the edge of the clearing, quietly searching for large sticks to feed the fire. With 5 good pieces cradled in one arm, he held his Jai-He rope ready in his free hand and silently moved into the open, using the large stone for cover. Crouching next to the fire, he carefully fed it a branch. When he heard very loud, steady breathing inside the foot, he fed the fire again. In the relatively quiet night, the creature's sleeping noise was like a wounded animal calling the forest to take it back. TT was surprised that no Jai-He were descending on the foot to eat the creature while it slept. Grateful that was not so, he fed the fire, then curled up next to the rock and drifted into sleep. As the sun began lighting the sky, he learned that the creature awoke with as much noise as it made while sleeping. Dashing into the forest before it came outside, he learned several things very quickly that morning. The creature was smart. It immediately noticed the branches that TT had set by the fire. Discovering that its fire was still alive, it stood motionless, searching the edge of the clearing. The creature could talk because it made several noises. Each time, some sounds varied slightly, but it repeated others. Dare was the most consistent sound. TT practiced shaping the word in a whisper. The creature was so smart that it tried to see if TT was not. It set a piece of wood, which held food, on its sitting rock, then went inside its foot. When some core birds swooped down and began pecking at the food, the creature remained inside but chased them away by flinging small stones at them. Amused with its attempt to lure him from cover, TT considered boldly stepping into the clearing, but wisely decided to ponder the creature further. Later that day, a tailing wandered into the open to graze on the fresh grass. The creature stepped from its foot and hurled a short stick with enough force to pierce the tailing's neck for an immediate kill. Somehow, the stick had come apart, and the creature still held part of it. TT was impressed with the kill, but he missed the details of how it hunted. Until he learned that, he was not about to let it see him. He decided to swing well downwind before making his fire. While clearing away a circle of soil, one thought suddenly filled his mind.
That was the crossing. I am at the water forest where my father told me I would find a crossing.
Absorbed with his thoughts, he did not eat that day. Animated by reflex, he brought a fire to life, then began plucking leaves from nearby footgrass bushes. The first part of his pondering was complete. With his pouch containing more packer nuts than he could count, he began weaving a foot. He knew he would be remaining here until his packer nuts were gone. Sleep was impossible that night. By morning, he had woven the bottom portion of a foot and mounted it high in a strong tree. During the next 3 days and nights, he refined a game of sneaking in at night to feed the fire while the crossing tried to stay awake and catch him. During the days, it would tend its fire and stare at the thing in its lap, but it always carried that deadly stick or set it next to him on the rock. One night, TT offered it a gift by leaving a skewered jip-jip cooking over the fire. When the crossing came outside the next morning, it rushed back into its foot, then returned with that deadly stick. Alert for a test, it stood motionless, warily searching the clearing's edge before investigating the food. Eventually deciding that it was safe to eat, the crossing uttered a sound that TT understood to be thanks. That night, after the crossing ate, it set a hollowed piece of wood filled with food on the large rock near the fire. The food's aroma was tantalizing. Waiting for the creature to make its loud sleeping noise was difficult, but when it finally did, TT crept silently to the rock and sampled the gift. Inhaling its aroma, he nearly crooned in delighted surprise. Pieces of tailing meat, roots and herbs were floating in murky water. Tilting the wood, he poured some into his mouth. His eyes grew wide, and he had to concentrate to stifle a gasp. He had never imagined that food could produce so much pleasure. After such a magnificent meal, he felt as if his gift of a simple bird had not been equal. As dawn began lighting the forest, he set out to find the ingredients in the gift. Even if he did not know how to put those things in the fire, especially the water, he was certain that the crossing would use them. He also hoped it would leave more food on the rock. TT returned that afternoon with a small, skinned and gutted tailing. Roots, nuts, berries and herbs filled its cavity. When he approached the crossing's clearing, he was certain that it had heard him approach. As the crossing tended to its clearing, then began pondering the thing on its lap, it occasionally glanced into the woods. TT did not see its deadly stick, but that could have been very good deception. Remaining 2 trees away from the clearing, TT stole brief glances until night. As darkness grew full, the crossing went inside its giant foot and began tending its fire and food. He moved around the clearing until he felt safely close to the fire, but still hidden in the foliage. Later, the crossing set more food on its sitting rock. It faced the forest where TT had arrived that morning, then said something. TT wanted to respond, but that would not have been consistent with the game, so he merely waited for it to sleep before he ate and fed its fire. He left the gutted tailing on the rock. The next morning, he returned to his small camp, then set to tending to his own long-term needs. He spent the remainder of that next day weaving his foot. That night, his meal seemed flavorless. He felt lonely, often glancing the crossing's direction. Resisting his urge to hurry back, he spent the next day finishing his foot. The act of making a permanent home brought him to practical matters like gathering nuts, berries, and roots before whitewater. As the moon progressed through its cycles, TT took time each day to prepare for the coming cold season. Each morning, after tending to his daily needs, he would swing to the crossing, eager for every moment of learning. He felt a growing sense of fondness toward the strange creature. When he approached its clearing, he looked forward to his first glimpse of its foot. 2 or 3 swings from its clearing, he would cross the remaining distance on the ground. The crossing seemed to know when he arrived, but it no longer tried to find him. For days, it went about its business tending its clearing. TT began to notice how it also was preparing for whitewater. It began gathering roots, tubers, nuts, and fruit from one patch of soil close to its foot, collecting far more food than it could possibly need through the cold season. TT was anxious to share this stunningly obvious concept with the circles. When it was not gathering food or tending to the plants that had not ripened yet, it would sit on the rock next to its fire and ponder the thing on its lap. When it was not pondering that, it talked incessantly, despite no other crossings being present. No other creature made as much noise. As the moon cycled from light to dark, TT began identifying its words for fire, water, trees, and food. Gradually, he recognized some sounds it repeated for many different things, although they seemed to have no meaning.
Abla said Koda. Abla said Ort. Abla said Fulris.
One morning, while sailing above the trees for one of his cherished views of the crossing's foot, he was certain that it had seen him. He dropped below the canopy and halted, unsure if he should go closer, since he still had not seen how it hunted with that stick. An unexpected idea left a smile on his face as he swung away from the crossing. The forest was almost below the sun when he finally drove a small tailing toward the clearing. After setting himself in a tree to remain hidden, yet able to see, he imitated a Jai-He attack roar. Following its instincts, the tailing darted for its life. The crossing also had heard him, of course, because it dashed into its foot, then reappeared with its stick. It was so concerned with the Jai-He it thought was coming that it ignored the tailing that darted by within reach. The result had been so obvious, TT felt foolish for expecting anything different. He already knew the crossing was not afraid to test Jai-He, but he was certain they would eventually face each other without it trying to take his fur as a gift. It became so nervous about the Jai-He that TT was not going to provide a target for its stick. He returned to his foot and spent most of the moonless nights staring into his fire, pondering how to get the crossing to trust him or not see him as a test for gifts. The crossing was a very smart creature, and it understood the forest very well. It wore Jai-He furs because it had almost no fur of its own. On hot days, it would take off its furs, exposing hideously naked skin that shocked TT each time he saw it. With only a mane on the back half of its head, the lower part of its face, and small patches of fur under its arms, TT felt that he understood why it covered itself in Jai-He fur. That thought made him consider his fur and whether the crossing would want to use it. Again, the creature became more dangerous. Almost everything he learned about it made it deadlier. A few mornings later, while soaring over a tree, TT saw the crossing standing near its fire, leaning against a tall, gnarled branch, looking very much like Xiao To in its grey Jai-He fur and bushy upside-down mane. It clearly saw him while he was in the air. TT swooped from his swing and stopped against a trunk, pondering what to do. Facing the test of courage, he peeked around the tree. The crossing raised a hand and said something in a gentle tone. TT remained motionless. After a few moments, the crossing bared its teeth and exhaled sharply. it started walking toward the water forest. Intrigued, TT shifted to watch it. The crossing had never left its clearing before. TT had pondered the creature long enough to know that the crossing was very old. Despite its ability with that stick, which TT still had not observed, he felt a need to protect it from any Jai-He that might be hunting. He moved through the trees, paralleling it to keep it in sight. The crossing did not look his way, even when TT made noise. It followed a faint ground trail toward the water forest, seemingly unconcerned with the noise that it was making. TT was afraid the crossing was making so much unnecessary noise that it would attract any roaming Jai-He. In sudden clarity, he realized he had not seen any Jai-He since discovering the crossing. That thought stunned him into motionlessness, looking about the forest. The spell was broken when he saw that the crossing had stopped and was watching him with an expression of concern. After a moment, it began babbling for a very long time. The game was over. Sustaining deception was pointless. TT waited quietly, listening carefully to its sounds. The crossing suddenly bent over while making the most unusual, rapid, high-pitched noises. Eventually it fell quiet, then began walking again, frequently glancing over its shoulder to see if TT was still following. Scents from the water forest grew stronger. Between the remaining trees, he saw patches of blue and red. Even through his broken view, he detected something different. Reaching the forest's edge, he felt shocked to discover many more stones than before. The crossing began walking with a hunter's stealth as it neared the final bushes bordering the dead soil. TT understood its posture and motions, although he could not tell if the crossing were preparing to hunt or if it sensed danger. With so many unknown scents filling the air, TT could not determine which one was causing it to act that way. Stopping at the edge of the two forests, TT gaped at the sight. Completely dividing the water forest, the stone trees had somehow grown into a continuous jagged path leading to the distant forest. Huge grey, hairless beasts covered every possible space in the surrounding water and red stones, like weathered bones rising from grey, rippling skin. Almost half of their length seemed to be mouth and many rows of sharp, cutting teeth. The other half seemed to be tail ending in a vertical fin. The ones in the water were using their tails to move about, while those on the rocks or ground dragged theirs. His father's description of the crossing and water Jai-He was unmistakably accurate. The crossing hissed to get TT's attention. It began whispering and gesturing, rapidly bringing TT to understand its meaning. It had come from the other forest. TT looked at the rocks and water Jai-He, instantly accepting his father's inability to ponder such an enormous test. He turned his horrified gaze on the suddenly much more dangerous crossing. The crossing stood below him and spoke while pointing at the water forest, confirming its knowledge that the water Jai-He were lethal predators worthy of great respect. Sharing a common threat helped eliminate much of their mutual mistrust. They smiled at each other. TT wondered what he should call his new friend, since it was obviously not a crossing. His friend started speaking again. While walking away from the water forest, it continued talking after reaching its clearing. It frequently looked back to make sure TT was still following. When they reached the glade, TT's unwillingness to leave the trees brought the crossing to silence. It reached a conclusion of some kind, then went to feed its fire. When the flames were strong, it faced TT and spoke in gentle tones. Since they had ceased their game of deception, he decided it would be rude not to join it at the fire. He dropped to the ground and coiled his rope about his shoulders, but each step across the clearing was a test of his courage. The smile inside the crossing's peculiar mane was obvious. TT wondered why the forest would put it in such a strange place. When he finally smiled in return, the crossing made a short barking noise so loud and unexpected that TT readied his rope and looked about for a Jai-He. His action surprised his friend into silence again, then it began making soft words while smiling and gesturing with open hands.
Soke, I wo ercha, RCFA. Soke.
For the remainder of that day and into the night, they shared food, and with more of those frightening, senseless noises, his new friend confirmed TT's knowledge of its words like fire and tree. The sky was turning a soft blue before either grew weary, and the crossing tried to coax him into the strange foot. Thoughts of being surrounded by trees stacked in such a peculiar way frightened TT deeply. He solved the etiquette problem by curling onto the dirt next to the fire and making it clear that he was content. In the ensuing days, the crossing used a small stick to make marks inside the thing that it pondered every day. The thing spread open like a peculiar flat-sided pod with white leaves filling it. When the crossing completely marked 2 of the leaves, it moved one aside and exposed 2 clean ones, then began marking those. Guessing that they were words, TT was astonished with the cleverness of the idea. He was eager to return home to tell the voice and Xiao about this. The moon passed through its cycles while the forest prepared for winter. TT's daily journey to and from its clearing seemed almost pointless as their friendship developed. Sometimes he wondered why he had not seen or heard any Jai-He since he arrived. One conclusion he reached was that the water Jai-He had eaten them all, but he never remained there long enough to see what they ate. The nights grew colder. Mornings took longer to receive the sun's warmth, and scattered patches of yellows and reds speckled the forest's greens. One brisk morning, as he approached the clearing, he smelled blood and realized that the forest was silent, signaling that Jai-He were nearby. He began swinging faster. While skipping a tree for his first sight of the clearing, everything looked normal, but undefined details triggered suspicions that something seemed terribly wrong. His last high arc over the canopy filled him with dread when he saw his friend lying on the ground. Next to him, a dead Guka had one of the crossing sticks deep in its neck. When he reached the meadow, he saw one of his friend's legs was bleeding. A Guka's tusks could be as deadly as a Jai-He if they stabbed deeply enough. Downwind, an unseen pack of Jai-He began barking their hunting cries, shaking the trees violently as they approached. TT hit the ground on the run as the pack reached the opposite edge of the clearing. 4 Jai-He soared from the trees and began their awkward loping dash across the open ground. TT boldly raced to place himself between his friend and the rampaging masses of teeth and claws. The Jai-He leaped with their forearms spread apart for a crushing hug that would pull prey into their large, powerful jaws. He slid to his back, leaving the pair of Jai-He sailing over him. Blindly, he hurled both claws. His rope went tight from 2 solid strikes, which sent the Jai-He crashing in torn, bloody heaps and his shoulders aching from the sudden force. The remaining 2 skirted around him to reach the food as the rest of the pack flocked out of the trees. TT yanked his rope free, pulling himself upright with the motion. To confuse them, he roared a challenge for dominance. Most of the younger males and females loping toward his injured friend suddenly changed course and sprinted toward the trees. Confused, the Prime stumbled to a dust-scattering stop, snarling and spitting in rage with its mane splayed, searching for the upstart that would dare to usurp him. Several more males scattered to make it clear that they had not issued the challenge. TT screamed again to confuse them. This time, the Prime focused on him. It left the ground with a push from its powerful hind legs, sending lesser males and females scattering from his path. TT rolled toward the Guka while hurling a claw at the leaping Prime's abdomen, cleanly eviscerating it. As the Prime's dying shriek ceased, the males began yipping for ritualistic fight, re-entering the clearing with zeal. Most of the females dashed for safety from the coming combat, but a few continued toward the food that the males were ignoring. Inciting the males into action, TT barked the pre-kill sound. Several Jaihi ripped into a violent knot of terrible noises, flashing claws and waves of blood, fur and gore. He swung his rope at the Gurkha, sinking one claw into it, then flinging it toward the trees. The females followed its motion as chaos spread through the males. TT started dragging his friend toward the foot while holding his rope ready in his free hand. Fortunately, none of the males saw him as competition for dominance. He dragged the crossing a safe distance inside, then returned to the entry and stood ready to test any Jaihi that came close. Using his time wisely, TT studied the males moving from victory to challenge or giving up the fight, retreating to the trees. As the number of males dwindled from death, injury, or escape, he noticed superior cunning in a particular young male who was probably just reaching maturity. The two oldest were deep in furious battle when the young one finished his last challenge. He began circling the remaining two. It had been a great test of strength and swiftness. Either would have made a fine prime or rope. One would slash as the other ducked and lashed in with a mouthful of long, sharp teeth. Using the naked underside of their nimble tails, each tried ensnaring its opponent's legs, only to find his rival had already moved and was attacking. So swift were their motions, TT did not see the error. One wrapped its powerful jaws around his opponent's neck with crushing force. Before it released the carcass, the younger male landed across the victor's back, closing his jaws around the base of its skull with an audible crunch. Impressed with the young Jaihi's guile, TT grunted his approval along with the rest of the males in the trees. With blood and slobber dripping from his fangs and its mane splayed, the new prime locked its eyes on TT's, then screamed a victory cry. TT grunted louder and meant it. With a snarl rippling one side of his long snout, food forgotten for the moment, the new prime turned away and sauntered through the torn and mutilated carcasses to the females that were now his. Flocking as one, the rest of the pack fell on the Gurkha. The crossing was still bleeding. TT was concerned that the pack would remain near the taunting scent. A wrapping of knot fur covered its legs. Precious moments passed before TT decided to rip it open and expose the wound. The sight of its nearly hairless skin was repulsively shocking, but his task let him ignore it. Fortunately, the knot fur had kept dirt from the cut. With no water, he spit into the wound to clean it. By squeezing more blood out of the puncture, he washed out the spit and anything else. The puncture was deep and wide, but the blood was not flowing very fast. He opened his medicine pouch, then began packing red moss into the injury, holding it tight until the bleeding stopped. Needing something to tie around its leg to hold the red moss in place, he looked about the foot's interior. It would take days to see all the details. He could identify none of what he was seeing, except the many piles of knot fur that were everywhere. With hastily muttered apologies, he reached into the closest pile without looking. Surely the crossing would be willing to sacrifice a knot fur for this, but TT did not want to use one that it held dear. When he opened his eyes to see what he had grabbed, he groaned in distress at the beautiful white color. He had been certain that something so white was surely a treasure. Extending from a large part in the middle were two long, narrow parts. He pulled one off. The length and width were ideal, and it formed a perfect covering to wrap around the crossing's wound. After tying it securely, he dragged his friend further inside. Struggling to avoid stealing glances while looking for a secure place to put it, he discovered a wide, flat, soft rock thing covered with thick jahi furs. A dark space below it would perfectly conceal his friend. Pushing aside several knot furs, he checked for small animals nesting underneath. Satisfied that it was safe, he stuffed the crossing into the darkness, then used the furs from above to hide the opening again. With the crossing safe, he turned his attention to the entry. The jahi pack was still at the edge of the clearing, ripping at the gooka, but far more mouths than meat were out there. With no way to conceal such a large opening, TT needed to drive the jahi away. The soil near the fire pit was muddy with blood. It would take time for it to dry. He knew the fire would keep any but the bravest jahi from coming near, although the bravest one could already be out there. His best hope was to keep the fire strong, but if he were the only moving thing near the blood-scented dirt, they would see him as food. With resolve that he hoped would make his father proud, he gripped his rope and walked outside. The jahi, awaiting their share of the rapidly vanishing gooka, began yipping as TT crossed the clearing. When a challenge roared from his throat, the clearing went suddenly quiet. He had always imagined what the perfect jahi challenge would sound like, the kind that would strike fear or courage into the heart of the greatest prime. TT felt as if he had passed that test. Rushing to a low branch at the clearing's edge, the new prime began searching for the challenger. To ensure a response, TT roared again. Holding the new prime's attention, he began swinging his rope, walking toward the fire pit. When he roared again, the pack began yipping rapidly. The new prime dove from its tree. It crossed the clearing in 2 powerful strides, then lunged. TT whipped one claw forward, then realized he was about to be stabbed by its nimble hind claws that were reaching forward. Dropping to his back, barely dodging the attack, he launched the other end of his rope at its flank. His claw sliced its thick hide, drawing blood, but leaving far from a fatal wound. He doubted that it would even slow the beast. The jahi landed into a crouch, then immediately sprang back at its prey, with its forearms opened wide and hind claws reaching forward. TT hurled one claw at its face and the other at its belly, but the jahi's swiftness forced him to dive to the side, unable to snap either end of his rope. Both combatants twisted seamlessly into another attack, but TT's range was greater. As the prime reared to leap again, TT ripped a gash across its throat. He rolled away to avoid being crushed by the body, feeling its dead weight strike the ground. Before any of the other males could react, TT bellowed a victory scream. The pack scattered, shaking the trees like a powerful wind in their wake. Breathing heavily, he surveyed the clearing. 4 jahi had tested him, and 7 more died in their fight for dominance. Only the 4 he had tested were gifts, and each would make fine ropes. Spreading his hands in the Uda gesture of gratitude, he said,
Thank you, Forest, for strength and swiftness, and thank you, Jahi, for the gifts that you bring.
All of the enormous claws were free of black stains. Comparing them to the ones on his rope and the pair from his first jahi kill, the young prime's smallest claw was larger than the aged ones on his rope. The length and thickness of the elder prime's mane ensured enough hair to make a fine auburn rope. He had already mounted one of its largest claws in the rope he had been weaving over the previous 2 whitewaters. Its teeth, remarkable in size and condition, now adorned the braided string around his neck, framing his treasured jip-jip feather. While eviscerating the prime, he decided that all 4 of the enormous pelts would make fine gifts for his new friend. Working into the night, he set the gifts aside and dragged the carcasses to the far side of the clearing where the numerous smaller animals, insects, and slime worms could feast, but away from the foot's entry so they could not see inside. His stomach rumbled constantly and his limbs ached for sleep, but he dared not to leave the foot unprotected. Ignoring his hunger, He remained vigilant well into the next morning, pondering how to get food and water for himself and his friend. If he did not change the red moss soon, the forest could still take the crossing back. His solution seemed obvious when it came. The crossing may have more of that amazing food in its black rock hanging above the fire inside the foot. TT knew the social taboos of an uninvited entry, plus the clutter inside held too many unknowns and no way to know what was dangerous. Entering the foot before had been part of the test. This time, anxiety lifted the fur around his neck. Cautiously stepping through the entry, he reached to steady himself against a flat tree thing, but it moved with a groan when he touched it. He flinched in alarm, fearing he had damaged the crossing's foot. After studying it for a moment, TT saw that it moved freely by design. Curious, he pushed it again. A small pile of knot furs stopped it, but when he pulled his hand away, it moved toward him again. Seeing that it also moved the other way, he set it into motion and was horrified to see the entry suddenly disappear. His heart began pounding powerfully as he looked for a way out of the devious trap. Blocking his escape through the holes in the walls was some kind of hard air that was difficult to see. With growing panic and fading rationality, he used his rope to attack the thing blocking the entry. Tearing away huge splinters with each strike, he created a hole large enough to squeeze through, then he scrambled out of the foot. When he finally regained control of his racing heart, he decided to stand guard outside near the fire and let his friend heal on its own for a while longer. With the entry protected, he felt as if he could safely hunt for food from the edge of the clearing. He did not have to wait long before the scent of carrion attracted a small pack of gookas and other smaller scavengers. Water was not a problem either. Behind the foot, a small spring issuing from a rock formation formed a deep, clear pool, which drained in a shallow stream toward the midday sun. Standing in the stream to keep from spoiling the water in the pool, he skinned and gutted a gooka, then carefully washed his fur clean. After growing a strong fire to keep any animals away, he used the crossing's method of skewering the gooka, then setting it to cook over the flames. Just inside the forest, he found more red moss and baby white trees, which would absorb water and help heal a wound from the inside. Soaking the white trees in the pool, they quickly grew fat. Stuffing them between the crossing's teeth and cheeks would keep it alive by providing water and healing. He waited until after he ate to find the courage to enter the foot again. When he dragged the crossing from its hiding place, its lips were chalky white and its body heat was very high. Water covered its naked skin, but how it had gotten there was beyond TT's pondering. To keep from thinking about the blocked entry, he concentrated on replacing the red moss in its wound. The crossing's injury was healing very well. Redness was not spreading, and no bulb of pus was forming. He stuffed water-soaked baby white trees into its cheeks, then pushed the crossing back into the hole, covered the opening, then squeezed outside to wait. White water began falling that night. He had been expecting it for many days. His fur had already grown dense. The cold did not quash the fire's heat by day or night. TT reveled with thoughts of how the Uda could accomplish so much more throughout the year. Even on the coldest days, the Uda could gather to tell stories, braid new Jai-He ropes, and prepare for spring's return. The next afternoon, a shout from the crossing interrupted TT's excitement for the future. With joy filling his heart, he ran to the entry, then quickly squeezed through the hole. His friend was struggling to find an opening in the hiding space. Rushing to help, TT pulled the furs away. The crossing greeted him with a shout of alarm. After making soothing sounds for several moments, the crossing finally grew calm enough for TT to feel safe about reaching to pull it out. Persuading it to grasp his hand, he pulled his friend from the hole. Fascinated, TT watched the crossing's many facial expressions as it pondered its condition. Finally, it smiled, then began softly making its strange, barking noise. TT smiled in return. He tried to explain how the crossing had been hurt and how he had helped, but it clearly did not understand. The crossing examined the room while pondering fiercely, then it tried to rise, using TT for support. Stroking the back of the crossing's white mane, as he would to comfort a friend, he tried to assure it that everything was safe. His friend fell motionless and silent when it focused on the entry. That was when TT learned the word for door.
I habla said door.
With determination and great effort, his friend staggered to the entry. Clearly in dismay, it examined the hole, running its fingers over the tortured wood.
Ooh, cat, I habla said door.
To show that he understood, TT said,
Door.
He displayed one of the claws on his rope, then explained,
I made an entry in the door.
His friend gaped at him for a few moments, then, with slumped shoulders, it slowly crossed the foot to sit on top of the hiding place.
Eat or upami habla said door.
TT smiled in embarrassment, wishing desperately to understand the other words, but he was glad that his friend was healing. It began talking as it went to the wall of stones where it made its fire. Eager to be helpful, TT rushed to him with his fire stones ready. The crossing seemed surprised by the stones, but it stepped aside and let TT bring the fire to life. During his journey, he had learned it was useful to have dry leaves on hand. Plenty of flakes were at the bottom of his pouch. Within moments, a flame was born, and he began feeding it small, partially burned chips of wood from previous fires. Despite being weak from its injury and healing, the crossing began tending the large black stone above the fire. Gradually, sense of his friend's amazing food began filling the foot. Later, they shared a fine meal, then spent the remainder of the day and most of that night teaching each other several words. He discovered that it had a name, Goat. It was certainly an odd name, but short and proud, and TT approved. They taught each other their words for fire, foot or house, snow, door, of course, and despite the lack of meaning, TT perfected how to say,
My rot-blasted door.
Goat seemed to derive great amusement from it, so TT repeated it a few times to show how well he could say it.
My rot-blasted door. My rot-blasted door. My rot-blasted door.
When Goat finally stopped making its peculiar barking sound, it placed a hand on TT's shoulder and said,
Thank you.
TT understood from its tone and the expression in its intelligent eyes. As Whitewater, or winter as Goat called it, settled over the forest, TT and his strange companion settled into a routine of lessons. As Goat learned TT's words, it made marks in its book. When Goat taught him new words, it also taught TT how to make the marks for those. TT shared his knowledge of which plants were good or bad. He even tried to teach it how to make a jahi scream, although Goat would never be very skilled at it. The lesson TT had been waiting to learn finally arrived one crisp morning when a small herd of tailings entered the clearing. The crossing's deadly stick was actually composed of 2 sticks, one to hold and throw a second stick. After a few lessons, TT could throw farther with greater accuracy than Goat, who seemed disappointed somehow. TT began braiding a jahi rope from the mane of the prime that he had defeated, working on it during lessons with Goat. His new rope would not be as pretty as the gift from his father, but he wanted to make the finest rope he could by packing the strands closely and tightly. As its length grew, winter faded into spring, and Goat and he grew wiser. Life exploded through the forest, providing a feast of incredible variety. Since Goat clearly did not like leaving his clearing, TT went hunting to supply fresh meat, herbs, roots, and whatever else he could find. Tailings, kikus, habas, and anything else on pad or hooves fell to TT's new stick. His success resulted in new and unexpected knowledge, tanning. Using amazing tools called picks and shovels, Goat and TT scraped open the soil over a large area of its clearing and shoved many different seeds into it. They even made a clever trench to bring water from the small pool to the seeds. It was such a simple idea to grow food so close to home, TT wondered why no one had ever thought of it. When the harvest finally came at the end of the warm months, he marveled at the quantity of food. If the circles had clearings like this, the forest would take fewer children each winter. His pouch of packer nuts grew lighter through the second winter and into spring. Using Goat's number words, only 8 remained. Thoughts of his impending departure saddened him. Goat was actually very old, and the forest might be swift to take it back if it were alone again. As his skill with Goat's language grew, and he began understanding and using more conceptual words, he tried to convince it to come to the circles with him. But Goat always declined with complaints about age pains. As terrible as it made TT feel, Goat was simply too old to make the journey. Conflicting emotions filled his mind with turmoil. He had grown very fond of Goat, yet he longed for the circles. The thought of teaching the Uda everything he had learned excited him to restlessness, but then he would consider Goat and fall further into confusion, which was why he had swung off to ponder in solitude. As he sat high in a tree, warming his face in a shaft of sunlight, pondering all he had seen and learned in 2 years, he wondered if his father would recognize him. He was certain he had learned wisdom, but would it show? Surely, with the growing collection of gifts draped about his body, he looked different. Most prominent was the quiver that held his throwing stick and its fire-hardened spears. Secured to a leather belt around his waist, soft, supple fur pouches that held TT's firestones and medicines had replaced his pouches of woven footgrass.
And this loincloth, which Goat insists that I wear.
At first, TT had thought the idea was absurd, although he quickly discovered its advantages of protecting his groin area while napping stones or moving swiftly through the foliage. Goat also taught him how to make a pouch from the stomach and fur of a tailing to hold water. He made one large enough to hold a 2-day supply, which he wore draped over one shoulder with great pride. His beautiful blonde Jai-He rope was showing signs of heavy use. He knew he did not have time to finish the one he was making. Leaving it here would be another excuse to return. Since it would be years before he would become voice, he planned to return to Goat as soon as he could. Thoughts of the forest taking Goat, or the gentle old crossing being alone for the remainder of its life, saddened TT. Not knowing how it would react, he could not find the courage to tell Goat that he needed to return home.
I have not grown wise enough.
Sitting with his eyes closed, absently raking handfuls of his shedding winter fur, he listened to the forest. Leaves fluttered in waves, moving away from the water forest as if the trees were alerting the others of the coming rain. Small animals scurried through the trees and across the ground. Birds sang in their variety of songs. Lifting his face to the sun's rays flickering between the leaves, he delighted in the way it warmed the reddish-brown fur on the sides of his face. A soft breeze gently rocked the tree, filling him with a rare moment of contentment. He gazed across the forest contours that barely qualified as hills. Some slopes were short and steep, but these vast, soft undulations failed to offer vistas as pleasing as those near the circles did. Silence suddenly spread through the forest. TT slipped into the shadows, searching with his senses. Fluttering leaves were the only motion or sound. This silence was much larger, much more dangerous than any Jai-He. The day grew brighter, drawing his attention to the water forest. A light, much like a very large, very bright fire, was moving within the immense bulbous cloud. In one deafening screech, birds of every kind surged from the trees and darted in every direction. The light breeze carried thick waves of fear scents Then sounds of terrified flight as every creature in the forest began fleeing in a chaos of crossing paths. Adding to the commotion, a whistling noise began growing loud. TT's heart was pounding powerfully. Fear coursed through him, but curiosity prevailed, and he scrambled higher in the tree for a better view. While climbing, he was surprised to see 4 Jai-He race below with no interest in testing him. Mesmerized, TT watched the fire emerge from the cloud, glowing brighter than the sun. Thick black smoke spewed from the flames in bulging lumps. Confused, he glanced at the sun to see if part of it were missing. Returning his attention to the light, it was much closer, lower. TT had seen stars spit pieces across the sky before, but only at night. He had no idea stars could be so loud, or that they would try to reach the same side of the sky as the sun. Strangely, instead of falling straight down, this star was falling sideways. The screaming sound grew to a thunderous roar that shook the forest. He could feel it through his tree. Raising his open palm to shield his eyes, squinting against the light, TT tried to understand what he was seeing. Even across the distance, he could feel heat from the impossibly bright fire. The droning roar grew louder as the ball of fire swooped over the forest, moving with greater swiftness than anything he had ever seen. Trees seemed to be flinching away from the fire as it passed over them, dropping inexorably closer. He ducked as the huge burning thing clambered above, missing him by at least a tree's height, leaving smoke rising from his fur and the leaves as it passed. Mesmerized with terror and wonder, he rose above the leaves again to watch. With a power TT never could have imagined, it effortlessly sliced into the forest. Striking the ground in a splash of smoke, dirt and whole trees, a giant cloud of fire rolled into the sky. The forest shook in a swiftly expanding ring, spreading away from the destruction. When the wave reached his tree, an inconceivably loud noise knocked him from his perch. He grabbed a passing branch, then quickly scrambled to the top of the tree again. At the end of a swath of broken trees and exposed dirt, soil and shattered trees were falling to the forest, while a rolling black cloud, laced with fire, climbed into the sky. Tilting his head, he tried to comprehend the impossibility of such a large tree coming toward him through the air. Finally, understanding it was real, he sprinted across the branches, then dove for an adjacent tree, hearing the one he abandoned and several others vanish in a terrible crash of shredding timber. Swiftly climbing the tree, he looked toward the devastation. A tall mound of dirt and tilted roots curved about the front of the injury. He could feel the fire's heat. Fear was one of the more powerful emotions swirling through his head, but awe held him in place. Like a physical blow to his chest, he simultaneously felt great joy and horror. TT never imagined so many glorious and terrifying emotions. From his vantage point, he quickly determined that he was the only living thing around. He looked to see if any more stars were coming, but except for the trail of smoke that marked its path, which was already breaking apart, the sky beneath the giant cloud was empty. The only things that ever came from the sky were wind, rain, and white water. How something like this could fall from the sky was beyond his pondering. The conclusions that dashed through his mind all seemed ridiculous.
Perhaps the sky is angry at the forest. Did the sky just test the forest? Is that how stars die?
He focused on the wound in the forest. His father's warnings sounded clearly in his head, and he felt real fear that the whole forest was about to die in a great fire.
This is a test of fire.
With the boundless gifts that the forest provided for every living thing, he could not simply let it die. He had to try something. Pulling his rope from his shoulder, he sprinted across the branch, flung one end forward, then began racing to the scene. Facing fire as a test felt uniquely intimidating. His only tool with which to protect the forest would be dirt. Reaching the edge of the destruction, he he stared awestruck. Scooped into the forest floor, a long, mangled gouge ended in a huge, curved mound of bare dirt. Trees surrounding the new clearing had been sheared away or fractured into splinters. He felt suddenly weak with relief to see the ring of soil containing the fire. At the center of the devastation, a black cloud of fiery smoke was belching from the thing that had fallen from the sky. The heat was intense, even at this distance. Using a hand to shield his eyes from the intense brightness and heat, TT's fears gradually softened into amazement as he examined the gift from the sky to the forest. He had never seen such a color before. It was as if it were no color at all. Like solid water, areas not stained from the fire or smoke showed reflections of the sky and trees. One end rose at an angle over the ground, while the other end lay crumpled into the curving mound of soil. A glowing liquid was dribbling from a blossom of white-hot flames on the raised end, flowing into several gouges, looking very much like long, shining fingers. A crashing noise from near its middle drew his attention. He was unsure which emotion to feel when a crossing tumbled out of a gash on the thing's side. Half of its face was black, like food left over a fire too long. Smoke clung to its short mane and not fur. Many deep, bloody cuts marked its body as if Jai-He had tested it. Unable to stand, it struggled to crawl away from the fire. Amazement began overwhelming TT's confusion when he concluded that the strangely colored thing must be this crossing's foot. Discovering that crossings could make entire foots skip trees, TT instantly knew that this creature was precious.
We must not waste the forest's gifts, of the forest will take them back.
He glanced at the slowly dissipating smoke trail.
Or gifts from the sky.
The crossing collapsed. Leaping from the tree, TT raced across the fractured clearing. He began hurling dirt onto the flames, consuming the knot fur covering the crossing's legs. Flinching from the fire's great heat, while emptying his water pouch onto the mound, he knew they could not remain here.
Goat will know how to help.
Its groans meant that it was still alive. TT rapidly unburied the crossing, then hoisted it onto one shoulder. Straining under its great weight, with its feet and hands nearly touching the ground, TT began staggering across the broken gouge toward Goat's foot.